Okay, my friends, this is really an amazing day in Jewish history. Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. Israel is celebrating. It starts tonight, the 28th of the month of Iyar. Celebration of liberation of Jerusalem. Jerusalem becomes united under Israel's sovereignty in 1967. We all familiar with this image I'm going to share with you right now. Of course, the image of Petrobras at the Western Wall. It's so moving. It seems like I cannot. When I need it, it's not there, you know. Unfortunately, I'm not very good with those things in technology. Somehow it fails me constantly. I prepare this image for you, but it doesn't want to open up for some reason. And welcome everybody with us on Facebook. Let's try. No, it's not working for some reason. I don't know what's happening here. Why I can't find the image that was ready for this presentation. Okay, let's consider it I've been a technically challenged person, okay? So please forgive me if some of the images will not display here tonight. Well, this is, of course, the story that takes us back to 1967. As a matter of fact, before 1967, Jerusalem not only was a divided city, if you would be an Israeli citizen, you would have an Israeli passport, you would not be able to come to the Jewish quarter. You would not be able to cross the barbed wire at the only point. Mandelbaum Gate was the only point of transition between the Jordanian and Israeli side. And this was right on what today is known as Kvish Mispar Echad, road number 1. On the way from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it passes right under the walls of the old city. And on the walls of the old city, all of the old city was occupied by Jordanians. Jordanian legionnaires were there. Jordanian snipers were there, and nobody could come in any close proximity. The only legal place to cross from one side of the city to the other was Mandelbaum Gate, and the access was restricted to Israelis. If you're American or British or any other passport, you would be able to visit the Western Wall between 1948 and 1967. If you're Israeli, they wouldn't let you do that. And that, of course, went against the signed peace agreement in 1949. When the war ended, war of independence ended in 1948. There was a peace agreement that was signed between Israelis and Jordanians. And under this agreement, Jerusalem was divided, but Jordan was supposed to guarantee free access to the holy sites. Of course, it failed to do so. Well, nothing new here. It's very, very unfortunate, but I'm going to show you some images from that period. I think now it's going to work. Let's see, this is the map. Those with us on Zoom, you can see the map with signatures of Israeli and Jordanian generals. You can actually see Yigael Yadin. I'm even going to highlight where it says Yigael Yadin to you. Over here in this area, you see there's a signature of Yigael Yadin and Abdallah Al-Tal, the Jordanian general. It's their hand signatures. This, of course, is from Israeli archives. And you see the lines on the map. This is basically the border. Jerusalem was divided. Jordanian legionnaires had very strong position in the old city that couldn't be taken from there. And unfortunately, the defenders of the Jewish quarter back in 1948, they had to surrender to overwhelming force of Jordanian legionnaires, very professional force, well trained by the British. And Jerusalem remained divided. Western Jerusalem was taken by Haganah and Etzel, by Israelis, but the old city, including the remained in the hands of Jordanians until 1967. And unfortunately, Jordanians did not uphold what they agreed on, at least on paper, to grant free access to Israelis to the Western Wall and to the holy sites of Judaism. I'm going to show you now, let's see, those with us on Zoom, you can see Jordanian legionnaire and Israeli police officers on the other side. This is the border. This is how it looked, right in the middle of a city. This particular image looks pretty friendly. It seems like there were more or less working relationship between Jordanians and Israelis, but there were many incidents and people were caught in fire quite often as Jordanians were sitting, occupying this very high position on top of the walls. If you're familiar with Jerusalem today, you can imagine coming to the old city from direction of the Jaffa Street or Jaffa Street towards the Jaffa Gate. As you cross the tram line was the barbed wire. The tram line was literally where this barbed wire was, and nobody, of course, could cross it. Another image I'm showing you now is a Jordanian legionnaire in 1948 at the ruins of destroyed synagogue. Most of the synagogues in the old city, in the Jewish quarter of the old city, were destroyed, exploded by Jordanians. This was done on purpose, of course, including the famous Hurva synagogue, which was recently rebuilt. It was done in the 90s. The money was actually given by Jewish Ukrainian donors from Dnipropetrovsk, and they gave the money for this project of rebuilding of Hurva synagogue. And of course, the cupola of Hurva synagogue is now one of the most famous landmarks of the Jewish quarter of the old city. Another image I'm showing you is from 1929. This is the Western Wall, and you don't even see the wall. These are the Jewish inhabitants of the old city of the Jewish quarter. As you can see, they're looking down at this line of buildings. And where is the Western Wall? You don't really see it. Now we're familiar with the side of a big plaza in front of the wall now. This was done in 1967 when it was liberated, and its Arab inhabitants of the quarter that you see over here on this image. The quarter was called Mugrabi. This was the fifth quarter of the old city. This quarter was totally evacuated. Its inhabitants left during the war in 1967, and all this territory was basically becoming a plaza. That's the image that we're familiar with nowadays, the plaza in front of the Western Wall. The access to the Western Wall before 1967 was very limited in terms of the wall itself being literally maybe about 20 to 30 meters long, that's all. It was very, very limited access. You would have to go through this Mugrabi quarter in between those very narrow streets. And to be honest, it wasn't very safe. You know, in 1929, during the British Mandate period, the pogroms and the Arab riots started right there. And it started with some Jew moving the chair a little bit away from the Arabs thought it should be. And literally, that's how the pogrom started in 1929. So looking back at history of Jerusalem and looking back at the significance of Jerusalem for the Jewish people, of course, we're going to look at Tanakh, we're going to look at the books of the Bible, and for us to understand what Jerusalem stands for. And of course, I didn't share with you the image I wanted to share with you. Let's do this now. I think now finally I found it. And this is the image of the paratroopers at the wall. Let's see if we're going to see it. I just saw it. It was there. It was there. No, I can't see it again when I need it. This is so funny. You know, I'm really so bad with technology. You can't imagine a person being more technologically challenged than myself, probably. But I'm going to share with you something else. This is the original text of the Balfour Declaration, signed by Lord Balfour in November 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, it's addressing Lord Rothschild. And in the name of Lord Rothschild, it's also addressing the Zionist Federation. I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. But there was a clause, it had been clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The later been added, you'd be surprised, because there were some members of the parliament, Jewish members of the parliament in Britain at the time, who were very much concerned with Zionists making this shift of Jewish identity more associated with Palestine, with Israel, and eventually it may cause rise of anti-Semitism in England. So this clause was added to the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration becomes, of course, just at the beginning, type of a declaration of intentions of the British, because at this point, in 1917, we're still holding at war, and Ottoman Empire is occupying, Jerusalem is occupying what today is known as Israel. But very soon, that very year, 1917, Lord Allenby and the British Army will liberate Jerusalem. This would happen in December, and this would happen actually during Hanukkah. And to a large extent, the inhabitants of Jerusalem will see this, the end of 400-year Ottoman rule, and the beginning of the new era. They will see the British almost as liberators. They will see this, the beginning of the new era of Jerusalem and Israel and the Jewish people in the land of Israel approaching a new era. And well, indeed, the first period of mandate was a period of great cooperation, also officially approved by the League of Nations in 1922. And preamble to the mandate became this very declaration that I've just shown you. Balfour Declaration becomes officially recognized by the League of Nations, which of course is predecessor, basically what would become UN, United Nations after the war, World War II. Before the wars, we would have League of Nations, and League of Nations would be that international body that would officially be recognized throughout the whole world. They would officially grant Britain mandate over Palestine based on terms of this Balfour Declaration. So Balfour Declaration becomes very important. And at the beginning of British rule in Palestine, there's only about 50-something thousand Jews in the land. 15,000 of them live in Jerusalem. At the end of the mandate, we have, in 1948, 650,000 Jews in Israel, and we have more than 100,000 Jews living in Jerusalem. So we can clearly see how much was accomplished in those years. But these were not easy years, of course, especially after the Arab revolt, 1936 to 1939, it was an Arab revolt against the British rule of Palestine, and Arabs were demanding very strongly end of Aliyah. And if you think about this period of time, we're talking about Nazi Germany already being persecuting Jews. Kristallnacht is in 1938. Jews have nowhere to go, and now Britain has to appease the Arabs. And in 1939, Britain comes with so-called white paper, which was an official statement of policy of Her Majesty's government in Palestine. And in that statement of policy, in that declaration, in white paper, the British government basically says it fulfilled its obligations to the Jewish people by facilitating this massive movement of Zionists to Israel, to Palestine. And basically, it would not allow more than 10,000 a year and more than 75,000 altogether in the course of the coming 10 years. This basically, of course, was, if you think about it, millions of Jews at this point are trying to find a place where they're going to go. Germany at that point, actually, before the final solution, Germany would be quite happy to get rid of its Jews, but they don't have anywhere to go. No country would accept them. And at this point, Britain, which it's mandatory, it's Palestine, would accept the Jews up until that point, now says no more than 10,000 a year. It was a terrible time. During the years of the war, during the Holocaust, most would not even be able to cross and reach Palestine. It was very difficult, but after the war was ended, we have hundreds of thousands of Jews in those DP camps. We have them absolutely desperate. And so clandestine immigration starts, and we have a mass effort on part of the Zionists to bring as many Jews as possible which of course creates huge friction with the British. And you can think of those terrible images of people who experienced the Nazi death camps, who escaped, who were then in DP camps, who came to Israel, got arrested in 1946 by the British for being illegal immigrants, and sent again to the camps, this time to the deportation camps by the British. They were sent first to the camp in Atlit, and then they were sent to Cyprus. Quite a difficult story to really talk about. And of course, there was a fight against the British, and some Jewish group like Etzel and Lehi were taking very, very serious and strong stand against the British, including what British considered terrorism. There were many acts of not only civil disobedience, but of attacks on British property, on soldiers. And eventually, the idea was to persuade the British they're not in control and they would have to leave. And that's what they did eventually in 1947. They decided they're not in control, they cannot continue this, and they gave it over to the United Nations. And of course, in the United Nations, on 29th of November, 1947, there was this famous vote. And historically, if you think of what happened on 29th of November, Arabs were very much against the idea of partition. Partition plan, which was suggested and which was to be voted on 29th of November, there was a lot of politics behind it. Arabs were implying all type of pressure on different countries to make sure they vote against the partition plan. Jews, knowing that we're only going to get the borders that are not going to be very secure at the narrowest part of what would be suggested for the Jewish state, we only were going to have about 15 miles west of the country. Can you imagine this? 15 miles, being surrounded by hostile neighbors from, from around. And we know we're not living in Europe. We're not living in somewhere like Switzerland and surrounded by peaceful neighbors. We live in the Middle East. And yet the Zionist leadership agreed on that plan. And European countries, possibly feeling somewhat guilty after what happened during the Holocaust, and we lost 6 million Jews, all of them voted for the partition plan. And possibly this was the only time during the Cold War period, during the Iron Curtain period, right? These are two terms coined by Winston Churchill, of course, when both the Soviet bloc and the West voted together for the partition plan for creation of the State of Israel. On 29th of November, everybody in Israel was listening close to the radio, counting the countries who voted yes, who abstained, who voted no. Of course, all the Arabs were against it. Britain abstained. All the European countries, United States, and the Soviet bloc countries, Russia, Czechoslovakia, all of them voted for creation of the State of Israel. And of course, the delight, the excitement on the streets was unbelievable. On the other hand, Arabs were very angry, and they came very determined to destroy the state before it even gets created. 29th of November, Brits were still in the land. They announced they're going to leave sometime later in May of 1948, but the terrorist attacks against the Jewish people started right then. Eventually, Jewish community in Jerusalem will find itself in a situation of blockade. There would be no access to them because the road connecting Tel Aviv and Jerusalem will be under constant fire, and it would be impossible, literally, to get to Jerusalem. And that's how, unfortunately, when the State of Israel was proclaimed 15th of May 1948, this was done not in Jerusalem, this was done in Tel Aviv. The reason for it's been done in Tel Aviv and not in Jerusalem, my friends, is because Jerusalem wasn't safe. We couldn't make sure to get there and have this declaration in our capital simply because it wasn't safe. And back then in 1948, as I said, Jerusalem remained a divided city. Israel proclaimed its independence right at the point where the British mandate was basically announced to be finished. And on that day, an official war started. Up until that point, there were just some acts of local bandits against Jews. But on 15th of May 1948, when a state was proclaimed, it became an official intervention of different Arab countries, some of them not even having common border with Israel, like Iraqi army was sent there too. So we had Iraqi army, Lebanese army, Jordanian legion, which was the strongest force in the region, of course, because Jordanians were really very well trained by the British. Egyptians in the south. All of these countries, all of these armies were attacking. Syrians, of course, were attacking the state that just got created. And these boys who just came from the TP camps, you know, they were given rifles right away. They were sent to the battle. And the battle was basically the battle of survival. The Arabs were very clear. They said to their populace in Haifa and in Jaffa, please evacuate your homes as we're going to shell the cities, and you'll come back victorious with victorious Arab armies in 2 weeks, and the Jews will be eliminated. They will be sent to the sea. The idea was, from the Arab point of view, that Israel has no right to exist, and all of the land belongs to Arabs. Of course, this was a very difficult year in 1948, as we can imagine, but with determination to fight and with help of Hashem that was constantly evident throughout the course of the war, this war was won. And eventually, Israel was created and unfortunately wasn't recognized by its neighbors. Until today, we don't have a peace treaty with Syria. Until today, we don't have an official border with Syria or Lebanon. You think about it. The question of the borders is still there. We only have peace treaty with Egypt, and we have a peace treaty with Jordan, but we don't have any official border with Syrians or Lebanese until today. And certainly in 1948, 1949, we had armistice agreements with the countries who got involved with war against us, but we didn't really have any official borders. They were still officially in a state of war with us. And in Jerusalem, the situation was the most difficult. The border was literally right in the heart of the city, in the center of the city. And I've shown you the map, you saw it. It was really very fragile border. Very difficult situation in the city, which was divided for 19 years. In 1967, when the war broke, we know this was a preemptive attack that Israel launched against Egyptians in the south and Syrians in the north. This was necessary to do because when Nasser, who at the point was very much supported by the Soviets and got all the new weapons and got the Soviet advisors, he was very determined to destroy Israel. And United Nations was sitting in Sinai Peninsula, dividing Egyptians and Israelis. They were told by Nasser to evacuate the area. It was clear that Nasser is about to launch the war. And so Israel basically had no choice but to start this war in 1967 with preemptive attack on both fronts, on the Syrian front up north and Egyptian front down south. But Jerusalem at that point was quiet for the first 3 days of the war. Jordanians were told by Israelis through diplomatic channels not to get involved. But Jordanians felt, and they were under a lot of pressure from other Arab countries, of course, that they need to get involved, and they decided to get involved, started shelling the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem and taking over the positions of United Nations in the city. When this was done, this was considered to be a hostile act, an act of aggression, and IDF started its campaign in Jerusalem. This wasn't an easy campaign. Jordanians were very well prepared, and as I said, Jordanian legion was one of the most, one of the strongest forces in the area. At Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem, they have in celebrations every year. We need to mute everybody, please. Don't put yourselves on, as this disturbs the presentation. I will give you the chance at the end. So, at Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem, they were now having a museum. Every year on Yerushalayim, Yom Yerushalayim and Jerusalem Day, they're having a special ceremony marking hundreds, if not thousands, of paratroopers who gave their lives attacking these positions, very strong positions of Jordanians. And this wasn't an easy battle. Some of the areas in Jerusalem really cost us hundreds of lives of our soldiers. But eventually we remember the great joy of our soldiers, paratroopers, who finally came to the Temple Mount and to the Western Wall. The famous words of Mota Gur, Harabai Beidenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands, was transmitted on the radio. The chief rabbi, Rabbi Goren, blowing the shofar and saying the blessing Sheikhyanu, which is a blessing that we say very rarely on very special occasions, that we live to that joy, to that great joy of seeing the Western Wall, seeing the Temple Mount. This was a moment of true national joy and national unity. And for the first few months after the war was over, Temple Mount was basically free to access of many, many Jews. And this was the time of great celebration throughout the country. Then something happened which could be questioned whether this decision was right or not, but potentially, you know, history has its own course and certain things cannot happen at a particular time, you know, if we are not ready for them. Then government of Israel, the Labour government of Israel, 1967 makes a decision to give administrative rule on the Temple Mount to the Muslim committee known as Waqf. Waqf being at that point pretty much controlled by Jordanians. You would also have, of course, eventually Waqf becoming an organization that very much promotes Arab nationalism. And today, we have a very awkward situation. We have Jerusalem being united, being in the hands of Israel for quite a number of years, since 1967. You can make your own math. That's been quite a long time, right? More than 50 years we have Jerusalem been liberated. And yet, if I, as a tour guide, would like to take a group to the Temple Mount and tell you about the history of the temple and show you the images of the temple, immediately I would be told not to do so by the Waqf members. And if a Jew would like to go on the Temple Mount and pray to God, he wouldn't be able to do that until today. Only Muslims are allowed to pray there, and they do not allow any mentioning of the temple. And in recent years, this happened less than 10 years ago, Israeli archaeologists were very upset about what happened when Waqf, which has only administrative rights over the mountain, but acts as if it has its full sovereignty, decided to build a new mosque, underground mosque, which of course means destroying a lot of historical evidence in the course. And what they did, you know, in Israel, there's a law that before any project has been done, you need to do an archaeological dig, so-called salvage archaeological dig, to make sure that you don't have any important artifacts. And as you can imagine, Temple Mount is full of important artifacts coming from the period of potentially the first temple, going back more than 2,500 years ago. Of course, Waqf and Arab nationalists are not interested in any mentioning of us being somehow there way before Muslims came. And well, what was done from a point of view of not just political point of view, but from a point of view of archaeology was a real disaster. It was dumped into the valley of Kidron, underneath the Temple Mount, a huge amount of debris, and Israeli archaeologists would have to go and literally sift through all this debris, try to find things. By the way, today, there's a beautiful project, and everybody can take part in it, where you can go for some of those debris. Some of it hasn't been sifted through yet because there's a huge amount of work, and archaeologists are using help of tourists in that. And you occasionally can find something from the period of the temple. Of course, it would be much more valuable. It would remain, as archaeologists call it, in situ, in its place where it belongs. But now we have what we have. We're having this very ambiguous, very difficult situation with the Temple Mount technically being under Israeli sovereignty, but practically speaking, being in the hands of Jordanian Waqf. I'll just give you one example of how this works. It doesn't really work very well. Of course, very recently in our history, that's this basically talking about nowadays, this American administration, Trump administration, made a very important step of recognizing Jerusalem as Israeli capital. The importance of this step is yet to be understood. We are hopefully entering and approaching a new era of Jerusalem becoming a place that it's meant to become. Not just the place which is the capital of a modern state of Israel, which it already is, but also the place which becomes Yerushalayim, the city of peace for the whole world, the city from which the blessing of God's presence in the world will be spread throughout the whole world. And hopefully we are reaching this period of time. I would argue that 1948 and 1967 are two very important milestones in Israeli history. 1948, the state of Israel was created, and to a large extent, this was created as a secular Jewish state, which was a fulfillment of what Herzl would call normalization. You know, Herzl, who of course created a modern-day Zionist movement, and very first Congress in 1897, Herzl spoke about the significance of what is going to be accomplished. Herzl, who wrote a book, Als Neue Land, where he described the vision of a modern-day Jewish state, was a secular Jew, and he believed that the problem Jewish people are facing around the world, anti-Semitism, is going to be resolved when we are going to be equal in the family of nations. The moment we're going to have our own state, thought Herzl, we're going to be equal in the family of nations, and the world will recognize finally Jews as equals, and that will be the end of anti-Semitism. Ironically, Herzl got it right and he got it wrong at the same time. When in 1897, most of the Jews thought that he's a bit of a lunatic. You know, he's having these dreams about the Jewish state. He's going around visiting different rulers around the world, the German Kaiser and the Turks and the British, and trying to sell them this project of Israel, of Jewish independence. Many within the Jewish world felt that this is some sort of a dream. This is a fantasy. It's not going to come true. And Herzl said in 1897, you can think this being a dream or a fantasy, but 50 years from now it will become a reality. And lo and behold, 50 years, 1897 plus 50, 1947, we have this famous vote in the United Nations. Exactly 50 years later. You can say that we don't have prophets these days. It's true, we don't have prophets, but somehow Herzl had this prophetic vision, and exactly 1947, 50 years later, the state was created. It's unbelievable. But then again, you think about anti-Semitism, and the state of Israel was supposed to be the end of anti-Semitism because now finally we became equal in the family of nations. Let me remind you that in the 70s, United Nations, which is supposed to be the organization that treats all nations equally and promotes world peace, announced Zionism, form of racism and racial discrimination. More resolutions of United Nations were against Israel, hundreds of times more than against any other country ever in the world, as if Israel is the source of apartheid, as if it's the source of all evil in the world. And of course, we know clearly how biased, unfortunately, this international body, United Nations, is against Israel. And thank God, lately, American administration is doing very, very important steps in maintaining some sort of balance and trying to show the world that, some countries, at least the United States, this country is going to defend Israel, which is, of course, a very good and important step in the right direction. But what happened in 1948, the state was created following more or less the vision of what I would call minimalism. The idea of creating a shelter for the Jewish people succeeded. In 1948, we were under constant threat of attacks. One of our prime ministers said that the borders of 1948 are essentially Auschwitz borders. In other words, it's almost impossible to defend these borders. And yet Israeli leadership had a pragmatic decision, it's better than nothing, and accepted the partition plan. And we accepted this almost very vulnerable borders. It's almost impossible to defend, knowing that that's what we're going to get for now. And we're going to say thank you for this. And that's how Israel was created in 1948. And as I said, the war started right away, and we won in that war, and we were still very vulnerable within the borders of 1948 until in 1967, when Jordan decides to open the front against us. Not only we liberate Jerusalem, the eastern part of it, and we unite the Holy City under Israeli jurisdiction, we also come to what we know as biblical borders. All of Judea and Samaria has been liberated by Israel. And at this point, of course, there's a lot of celebration. But at the same time, Israeli government at the time, Labor government at the time has a problem. It doesn't know what to do with Judea and Samaria. And it decides not to extend its sovereignty on Judea and Samaria, thinking that eventually it will be a subject to some future negotiations. In my opinion and in my mind, this is a sign of a particular vision of Israeli Labor Party at the time, which didn't really understand the significance of these territories in Jerusalem from what we can call spiritual point of view. Because really, if you really think about modern day Israel, it experienced different steps in its development, different stages in its development. It started as a very, very secular state, and many of the leaders of Zionist movement, including Ben-Gurion, they didn't see much significance. They didn't pay much attention to our spiritual and religious values. One can think of famous statement made by Ben-Gurion in 1948, looking at the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem, Mea Shearim. He made a comment, we're going to leave this neighborhood as some sort of a museum. People are going to see how Jews were once upon a time. So religion was looked at as something that belongs to the past. And to a large extent, I'd say, you think about it from psychological perspective, you have a generation of the sons who went into Zionist movement, excited, willing to do something good for the Jewish people, but at the same time, very disconnected from their spiritual and religious roots. And this disconnect was quite present, especially in the first years of the state. And in 1967, when we got that gift from God, we got Judea and Samaria, the leaders of Israel, they don't really understand what's the significance of it so much. And they think more in terms of international law. And they say, okay, fine. So we're not going to annex it. We're not going to make it part of our country. And at that point, actually, many Arab leaders were kind of almost expecting Israel to do this. Because, of course, if they would have attacked, they would have destroyed us and would have taken the whole land. No question about it. Absolutely. But Israel decides not to do it. And so the status of Judea and Samaria remains somewhat very, very ambiguous. And again, if you take a look what's happening today, finally, we have an Israeli government that made a decision in this year, in July, to annex the Zone C, so-called Zone C, which is the area of the settlements in Judea and Samaria. And I think this decision shows the course of modern day Israeli history. There's more understanding and more recognition that Israel is not just a shelter. Israel is not just a place that's going to make us like everybody else, like normal. Israel and Jerusalem are really very, very important aspects of us communicating with God. And we are not just going to be like Shimon Peres was thinking in his book, New Middle East, another Switzerland. Switzerland is a great country. There's no question about it. I love Switzerland. It's beautiful, and everybody wants to be as economically developed as Switzerland. It's a nice vision, but it's a somewhat naive vision if you think about what we have that Swiss don't. We have Jerusalem, we have the Bible, we have our prophets, we have King David, we have from Isaac and Jacob. All of this is not just our history. All of this, apparently, we believe in it, is also part of our future. And if you take a look at the Christian world that looks at us today and sees that prophecies are coming true, I would even argue many Christians today understand it somehow better than some of us do. And let me go back to some of the prophecies and some of the visions of Jerusalem with you together today, so that we can understand, hopefully, what is the next step of Jerusalem's development and where we're heading now with, hopefully, new understanding of what Jerusalem stands for. I'd like to start from a somewhat unusual place, potentially. The first mention, an indirect mentioning of Jerusalem in the Tanakh, in the Torah, as a matter of fact. Of course, we know Jerusalem eventually will become a city that will be the capital of King David. And Jerusalem specifically would be mentioned as the place where King David would raise money from all the tribes of Israel, and he will be able to make this place a place that doesn't belong to any particular tribe, doesn't belong, so to speak, to any particular group of the Jewish people, but is the place that unites all the Jews. And of course, there's a deep symbolism in that. We're talking about roughly 1,000 years before Common Era. But way, way earlier, we have a very first mentioning of Jerusalem, somewhat indirectly, and we're going to see the story. I'm going to share with you, those of us on Zoom, a story of an interesting dialogue between between Abraham and a very mystical, mysterious figure who is called Melchizedek, the king of the city Shalem. We have all the reason to believe that Shalem, Ir Shalem in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, Ir Shalem, sounds almost identical to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem. And Shalem means two things in Hebrew. Shalom means peace, of course. So Shalem is related to that. Shalem also means whole. So it's the city of wholeness. And we have in the episode here in chapter 14 in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, where Avram, at this point, he's not known as Abraham yet. He's going to add a letter to his name later, when God will tell him to do so, but right now it's still Avram. Avram is hearing that his close relative Lot was taken captive in the war. And so he immediately arranges a commander force with his 400 allies. And on hot pursuit, he manages to rescue Lot and also rescue some of the captured kings, including the king of Sodom. Eventually, we see in verse 18, there's a celebration. And we see this mysterious figure, Melchizedek. Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Brought out bread and wine. And he's described as Kohen Le'el Elyon. He's the king or the priest rather, Kohen, the priest, to the Most High God. So he's a person who eventually we understand is some sort of a spiritual authority of the time. And what is it saying to Avram at this point? He says like this, and he blessed him and said, Baruch Avram Le'el Elyon, Koneh Shamayim V'Aretz. Blessed is Avram to the Most High God who possesses heaven and earth. That's verse 19. And then it says, and blessed be the Most High God who has delivered your adversaries into your hands. That's verse 20. So we see here the blessing being given to Avram and being given to Hashem by this unknown, mysterious figure who happens to be the king of Salem. Shalem in Hebrew. Shalem, the place of wholeness. And Jerusalem is that place of wholeness. And Jerusalem is that place where the blessings of God shall come true. And this is the very first time we see the reference to Jerusalem. Isn't it amazing to see this reference specifically as a blessing to Avram, who of course is the first Jew, who of course is Avram Ivri. He's the first Hebrew, he's the first Jew. And we understand the connection. Jerusalem being that place of unity and that place for where the blessings of God shall come true. Now we can think, of course, of King David. And King David is the person who eventually puts Jerusalem on the map in a really big way. He is the first king who manages to unite the tribes of Israel. He manages to create a strong kingdom, and his capital for the first 7 years was in Hebron. But in Hebron, his capital was a tribal capital. He only was a ruler of his own tribe, of Judea, of the tribe of Yehudah, of Judah. But then, next 33 years, he will become the king of all of Israel. And his capital, for this reason, will be moved to Jerusalem, which is not associated with any specific tribe. It's going to be the city right in the middle of his country, which is going to unite all the tribes together. So no matter what tribe you belong to, or on our modern terms, whether you're religious or secular, left wing or right wing, whether you believe in this particular Judaism or that particular Judaism, no matter what's your tribe, Jerusalem is your capital. Jerusalem is our capital. That, I think, is the message of what Jerusalem actually is. And of course, we know that Jerusalem will become the place of a temple that's going to be built by King Solomon, son of King David. David wanted very much to build a temple, but he was told by God through his prophets that you spilled blood. You shan't be the one to build the temple, even though he was waging all his wars with the right intention and with the right desire, basically to defend his people and to strengthen the positions of God and Israel in the world. This was all right. The fact that he spilled so much blood wouldn't be the right thing for him to build the place of where God will be dwelling in this world. And of course, God of Israel is a God of peace. And therefore his son, Shlomo, and the name Solomon, Shlomo, is his peace, right? Or peace be upon him. That's the name of his son. He is going to be the one to build and erect the temple in Jerusalem. And the temple will stand until Babylonians will come and destroy it in roughly 570 BC. And there will be a terrible campaign of destruction to be sent all the way to Babylon. By the way, we were not the only nation that left its country at that point. If you take a look at the map of ancient Israel, you're going to see our neighbors, Ammonites and Moabites. They also were captured by Babylonians, and they never came back. We came back, and they never did. The reason being, we had something that kept us together. We had something that we can describe as Jewish identity that was so strong that kept us together even when we were not in our land. And I'd like to share with you this beautiful psalm. And of course, this psalm is quite famous because very often we say the words of this psalm when at the wedding ceremony, we break the glass. Right before the groom is breaking the glass, it says, forget you, Jerusalem. Let my right hand forget its skill. And how does this psalm start? Let's take a look at it quickly. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat. We also wept when we remembered Zion. You see, Zion, which of course is the symbol, but also a real place. It's a place in Jerusalem. It's a place very close to the Temple Mount. It could be a euphemism for the Temple Mount, or it could refer to the place where King David's palace was on Mount Zion. So we're talking about Zion and Jerusalem as being the symbols of what Jewish people are and the symbols of our lost homeland. On willows and its midst we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for words of song, and our tormentors asked us, sing for us of the songs of Zion. It's almost like, give us some entertainment. You have been captured now. Sing for us some of your local songs. We'd like to hear. How shall we sing the song of the Lord on foreign soil? If I forget Yerushalayim, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to my palates. If I do not remember you, if I do not bring up Yerushalayim at the beginning of my joy. These are very, very famous lines. And of course, it's for a good reason that we are saying them very often at many wedding ceremonies right before the glass has been broken. And of course, this glass has been broken at the wedding ceremony to remind us that we cannot have a full joy, even though we have Israel as our sovereign land today, and we have Jerusalem as our holy capital. We are still way to go to true understanding of what Jerusalem stands for in spiritual terms and what Israel stands for. So therefore, we are still to break the glass. We are still to remember the fact that Jerusalem is still yawning with its great message of the world peace, with its great message of the Jewish people being the beacons of light for the whole world, with the idea, of course, the presence of God for the whole world, is still yearning to becoming a reality, to be part of our lives today. But we are making very significant steps in the right direction. And I think this year's celebration of Yom Yerushalayim in Israel is going to be marked by even more joy and elation than years ago, because we are coming very close to realization of a dream of coming to our biblical borders where Judea and Samaria finally will be recognized as part of Israeli territory. That's a very important decision, not just a political decision, a religious decision, a spiritual decision, understanding that all the stories of the Tanakh are happening there in Judea and Samaria. Our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moshe, King David, all of these great people. You think about all of the Jewish history throughout the time that described in the books of the Tanakh, and all our great leaders. They're all connected to Judea and Samaria. They're all connected to Yerushalayim, which is, of course, our undivided and eternal capital. And another psalm I'd like to show you, which, of course, if you really think about the meaning of this psalm, potentially it's a prophetic psalm, that possibly we only start understanding its meaning today. Remember, we spoke about the fact that Jerusalem was a divided city for 19 years between 1948 and 1967. Now let's take a look at this psalm. And let's try to understand what this psalm is talking about. This is Psalm 122. Shir HaMa'alot LeDavid, a song of ascents of David. Samachti b'omrim li Beit Hashem nilech. I rejoiced when they said to me, let us go to the house of Hashem. Omdot hayu raglenu b'sharecha Yerushalayim. Our feet were standing within the gates of Jerusalem. Yerushalayim abnuya, the built-up Jerusalem. Ke'ir shechubra la yirdav, a city that was joined together within itself. What is this? A city that was joined together within itself. Let's look at this line again. How does it make sense? Isn't it talking about the fact that somehow Jerusalem was divided and then it becomes united again? So we have a city that finally is being united. And as you read this psalm, you cannot avoid the feeling that you live at the time. Us, our generation of Jews, is living at the time the prophecy is being fulfilled. You think about this psalm, that so many interpretations were given to it, but a simple reading of the text is suggesting we're talking about that generation, 1967, that finally sees Jerusalem being united. And it becomes Ir Shechubra La Yechdav. It becomes a joint together within itself. It becomes finally a united city. And my friends, it's unbelievable. Further on, we see that this is a place where all the tribes of Israel will find peace in. There ascended the tribes of God, testimony to Israel, to give thanks to the name of Hashem. For there were set thrones for judgment, thrones for the house of David. Request the welfare of Yerushalayim. Sha'alu shalom Yerushalayim. Yishalu ohavecha. May those who love you enjoy tranquility. This, of course, is the blessing not only to the Jewish people, it's the blessing to the whole world. Today we have so many people around the world that are celebrating with us. Many Christians, by the way, are rejoicing together with us, seeing Jerusalem being united. Of course, we grant the rights of each and every faith in Jerusalem, and we have Christians and Muslims and people of all different faiths. And by the way, there's a beautiful celebration on Sukkot. Sukkot, of course, is being a holiday which symbolically represents the idea of the Jewish future. It's the holiday on which we have many nations of the world coming and marching in Jerusalem together. This Jerusalem march is a beautiful, beautiful celebration, manifestation of the fact that finally, these words are coming more and more true and becoming more and more part of the world we live in. May there be peace in your wall, tranquility in your palaces. Yeheh shalom b'chelech, shalva b'armonotayich. For the sake of my brethren and my companions, I shall now speak of peace in you. L'man beit Adonai Eloheinu avakshat tov lach. For the sake of the house of the Lord of Hashem, I shall beg for goodness for you. Of course, these are the words of the famous song, Manachai v're'ai. And this is the beautiful ending of this very poetic psalm. But if you really think about the meaning of the psalm, my friends, potentially, only now we start to understand what it means. Only now we see how these words are coming true. And I'd like to remind you of another beautiful prophecy, that of a very tormented prophet, Jeremiah, who unfortunately had to live through the time of destruction of the First Temple. And I don't know how many of you were in Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where there's a beautiful painting done by Rembrandt, of course, Jeremiah weeping over Jerusalem. If you ever happen to be in Amsterdam, I would very much recommend you going there and seeing this image. Rembrandt, by the way, who lived very close to the Jewish quarter in Amsterdam, had many Jewish friends, and he truly portrays a Jew. He couldn't imagine exactly how a Jew looked so many years back. And so he portrays him more or less in the contemporary garments. You almost like see an elderly Jew with his eyes full of sorry and full of very, very deep, tormented, like feeling of everything's gone. and he's sitting there and weeping, and he's surrounded by the ruins. He's surrounded by the ruins of Jerusalem. And he's looking somewhere, he's a prophet. He's looking somewhere probably where he sees things that we don't. But later on in his life, but he's going to be in Babylon with the exiles. Jeremiah is going to come up with a prophecy of comfort. And Jeremiah will go and come up with a prophecy every single time, my friends. I'm going to Jerusalem, I remember these words. Od yishvu zkenim uzkinot birchavot Yerushalayim. There will be time, says Jeremiah, the same prophet that witnessed destruction. And he didn't have a fortune to witness what we see today. We see his words coming true. There will be time, he said, that the elderly people will be sitting in the streets of Yerushalayim. Yeladim ve'yeladot mesachakim berchovateya. And the little cute kids, little children will be playing on the streets. So every single time I come to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem, and I see these kids playing on the streets, and I see the elderly people sitting and chatting, my eyes are filled with tears. I'm thinking of the prophecy of Jeremiah coming true. And we truly have a very, very unique opportunity today. The Jews, we're the people to say thank you to God. The meaning of the word Yehudi is Yud-Hey, the name of God, and Hodeh is to say thank you. We have a privilege of living at the time of great miracles. We have a privilege of living at the time when finally Jewish people are become worthy of the greatest of miracles we can possibly imagine. Not only we have in Jerusalem be united under Israeli sovereignty, now we come to full understanding. We're still not there yet, but we're coming more and more to understanding that Israel is not just a place of shelter. And of course, the problem of anti-Semitism would not be solved by just us becoming like everybody else. Because what the world wants from us, even if it doesn't know it, it wants from us to be the source of blessing for the world. And we have to come up to where God and the world actually wants us to be. We have to come up to that understanding where we're going to be seeing Jerusalem not just as the capital of a modern state of Israel, but hopefully also as a place from where peace will come to the whole world. From there, a message of presence of God will come to the whole world. And that's Jerusalem being the eye of the universe. That's Jerusalem being truly the capital of everything that is godly in the whole world. And hopefully, we are going to see many, many more miracles in our days. And I think we are very fortunate for that. And we should certainly say, Shechianu v'kiyimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh, that God actually sustained us to these very days, and He made it possible for us to see all these great miracles. And of course, I'd like to finish with saying, dear friends, may we all be blessed with being able to see goodness in the world around us. And please God, we should have the opportunity to see many, many more miracles connected to modern day Israel and Jerusalem, and coming, truly, the words of the prophets coming alive right in our days. I've just shown you some of them, but of course there's many, many more. With that, I'm going to finish on Facebook and wish everybody here a wonderful celebration of Yom Yerushalayim. Thank you for watching. So we're down on Facebook and here on Zoom. I'm very happy to take your comments. You can unmute yourselves if you wish. And I'm very happy